Hey everybody, thank you for joining us. I'm Catherine Bracy. I'm the founder and executive director of the TechEquity Collaborative. You are joining us for the What Can Tech Do to Be Anti-Racist panel. We are going to start in just a few minutes, give folks time to filter in, so just sit tight. In the meantime, I want you to know that we do enforce a code of conduct at all of our events, online and in person, which one of the TechEquity staffers can share in the chat if you want to read more, but essentially, it just says to respect everybody's humanness, to operate in good faith, and to allow this to be a safe space for learning. And again, we will get started in just a couple of minutes. Hello, everyone who's just joined us. This is Catherine Bracy. I am the founder and executive director of the TechEquity Collaborative. Thank you for joining us for the What Can Tech Do to Be Anti-Racist panel. We are just waiting to allow people to filter into the room before we get started. If you have any questions or technical issues, please drop those in the chat function right now, and we'll be getting started in just a minute. Okay, we're seeing a pretty good number of people who are already in, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We want to give this conversation as much time as we can. So again, I'm Catherine Bracy. I'm the founder and executive director of the TechEquity Collaborative. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this really important conversation. Before we get started, I just want to tell all of you who are new to TechEquity who we are and what we do. We are an organization based here in the Bay Area that is mobilizing tech workers and tech companies around issues that we think will make it so that as the tech economy grows, everybody is benefiting from that growth. And so we do three things. We do education for tech workers and companies, events like this to help people who work in the tech industry understand the issues that we work on. We do issue advocacy, so we have a policy agenda that we work to advance, and we enlist tech workers and tech companies to help advance that policy agenda. And we connect tech workers with their neighbors and with the communities where they live to help them build a better sense of empathy and connection to our neighborhoods and our neighbors. And we focus on two main issues: housing and workforce and labor. We've identified these as really the critical issues that we need to advance if we're going to see a growing tech economy that's creating opportunity for everybody. Obviously, there is a huge racial equity component that is built into each of these, and we can talk a little bit more about how we see this conversation about anti-racism in the tech industry tying into the public policy agenda that we focus on. So without further ado, I want to get onto our great set of panelists. Before we start, I think it's important to just kind of set the context for why we wanted to have this conversation. In the wake of the movement for Black Lives protests and after George Floyd's killing earlier this summer, we really saw unprecedented levels of kind of support from the business community, including many tech companies with donations in the tens of millions of dollars to organizations who work on racial justice issues, which was great. It was great to see that kind of outpouring of support. But at the time, I personally felt a little bit nervous about how authentic that commitment to racial justice really was. And for those of us who have been working on diversity in tech for many years, I think it's hard not to be a little bit cynical knowing how hard it has been to really advance this conversation inside the tech industry, to believe that there was really a real change behind a lot of those statements. And I think we've seen over the last couple of months, now that we're a few months removed from the height of the protests, that kind of interest has waned a little bit. And so we think it's really important to keep this conversation going, and also talk about how we continue to put pressure on tech leaders, business leaders, and other allies to continue doing the work that we need to do in order to win this fight. I saw some recent polling that showed that support for the Black Lives Matter movement has fallen off significantly since June among white people, and that's a little bit disappointing, but I think a lot of us who work in this space thought, weren't actually that surprised by that. So I think this conversation is coming at a really good time to try to keep the momentum going. And I'm really excited to talk about what we as tech workers can do to really push the conversation forward. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists. We're going to talk to Cynthia Overton, who's the Director of Tech Workplace Initiatives at the Kapor Center, Maurice Wilkins Jr., who's a Global Diversity and Inclusion Lead at Fastly, Ulysses Smith, who's the Head of Diversity, Equity, and Belonging at Blend, and Natrina Gandana, who's the Project Director at Next Chapter. Let me stop sharing my screen so everybody can see what's going on here. Cynthia, I want to start with you. I mean, you, as I mentioned, are the head of, sorry, let me get your title here, Director of Tech Workplace Initiatives at the Kapor Center for Social Impact. And you work with leaders across the tech industry who come from underrepresented Black backgrounds, including Black and Brown leaders of employee resource groups. And I'm hoping you can tell us, for those of us who don't know, what employee resource groups are. And I was hoping you could just kind of set the context for us. So tell us what the different aspects of tech's racism problem are before this summer's protests and now. How do they manifest? And what kind of data can you give us to help us understand the issue that we're going to be diving into here?
Right. So first of all, thank you for having me. I want to start off by really acknowledging the people who are listening in who are on the receiving end of racism in tech. It's painful. Your experiences are real. Don't give up. Please know that there are people who are working very hard to help fight racism in tech. What gives me hope is that many of you will be in the position one day where you are leading your own tech companies, and you'll be able to really show us what racial equity in the workplace looks like and how it's done well. I also want to just give a quick shout out to allies who are working so hard to fight racism in tech. Thank you for what you've done and what you will continue to do. In terms of the different aspects of tech's racism problem, I think that it's really, really, really important to acknowledge that systemic racism is real. For many Black people in America, this dates back to slavery. This is what started socializing people with racism, to believe that dark skin or people with dark skin are less worthy than or should be treated as inferior. And even though slavery ended in 1865, the socialization that Black folks should be treated as less than has really perpetuated through a host of other race-based laws and practices designed to oppress Black people, like, blocking folks from accessing housing, education, economic opportunities that are essential to wealth creation. And then, of course, by creating two criminal justice systems, which we see today, voter suppression. So I just really want to underscore and emphasize that systemic racism is perpetuated. It is ongoing throughout society, including the tech workplace. And it serves to make society believe that it's okay to treat certain people as inferior, and it is absolutely not okay. In terms of how it manifests, I think of racism in two categories: racism that is perpetuated by people, and racism that is perpetuated by workplace systems. When it comes to people, the historian Ibram X. Kendi teaches us that you are either racist or you are anti-racist. I've heard people declare that they are not racist, even though their actions may suggest otherwise. I've never actually had a conversation with somebody who was identified as racist, but again, actions show who we are. But I love, love, love to hear people say that they are working on being anti-racist, because it really signals ongoing progress and evolution as opposed to just sitting back and being complacent. I think one of the most common phrases that I hear when it comes to diversity and inclusion in tech is that we all have unconscious bias. I think that that is absolutely true, but it is also important to point out that that phrase should not stop there. Some of the unconscious bias that we hold is tied to racism in our society and can be harmful to people who are on the receiving end of unconscious bias. So I just want to point out that we don't get a pass because, you know, bias is unconscious. There are real consequences. My Kapor Center colleagues released the Leaky Tech Pipeline report a couple of years ago. And when we look at leaks in the workforce that negatively impact people of color, many of these leaks are tied to bias. And again, and what many people would try to explain away as implicit bias is linked to systematic race or to systemic racism. So we're talking about bias in resume reviews, that Black people with names commonly associated with Black talent from entering tech, bias in day-to-day workplace experiences, that Blacks access to challenging assignments and relationships with mentors and senior leaders for Black folks in tech. And then bias in the performance review process, of course, which impacts salary increase and promotion decisions. So I think that it's really important to be honest about bias that's perpetuated against people of color and the role that systemic racism plays in forming these biases. And then I also think about the role of workplace systems that allow for bias. So take identifying tech talent, for example. A lot of tech companies really rely on a system in which they give so much attention to certain universities as they prepare students to enter the tech industry. And many of these universities have very small populations of Black students. We see this attention to select universities through collaborations with professors, like over the needs of the tech industry, how they're preparing students for the technical interview, how they provide internship opportunities in these select schools, and then how they focus on recruiting efforts. So I also think about systems in tech companies that allow interview panels to do little or nothing to mitigate bias against candidates of color. And then you have systems that allow candidates who will actually be detrimental to an inclusive culture in tech to enter the workplace and even take on leadership roles. So you have systems also in which managers hold implicit bias against people of color when it comes to evaluating performance, which of course, and we talked about this, impacts salary, job assignments, et cetera, and then normalizing homogenous boards. So in addition to having the people who are perpetuating these issues, you have the systems in place that account for this. So, you know, what does this mean? Exclusion from opportunities in tech when it comes to people of color entering or experiencing upward professional mobility. And of course, this has very significant financial implications in terms of wealth building opportunities. But then it also influences what tech can produce. We see racism play out when Black folks are underrepresented in the workforce when it comes to, you know, Black folks being mistagged in photos or misidentifying Black people as criminals, housing ads that allow discrimination against Black people, and the list really, really goes on. So those are kind of just my thoughts in terms of race and racism and how it's reflected in the workplace.
Yeah, and really quickly before we move on to Maurice, I'm wondering, I mean, there's a specific, I mean, we could go on for days about all the ways in which racism manifests in the workplace, and that's, you know, in tech and elsewhere in the economy. But one kind of trend in the tech industry is to have employee resource groups as a sort of a function of, I guess, like community building inside the company for underrepresented groups. And in the wake of the protest, there has been a lot of like extra pressure on the members of those employee resource groups to kind of, you know, solve the problem of racism for these companies. Can you talk a little bit about the role that ERGs play in companies and how that issue of just sort of this extra emotional workload that's been put on them in the wake of the protests?
I would be happy to. First of all, I love that ERGs provide a space for people with a shared background and their allies to connect. I love the idea about members being able to be more engaged to support business interests of an organization. Sometimes that doesn't necessarily play out as we hope, but I like the idea of it. But ERG members are often expected to fix problems related to institutional racism that they are not responsible for creating or for perpetuating. And they're often expected to do it for free and at the expense of time that other people get to spend focusing on the role that they were actually hired for. So I actually really wish that ERG members could just take a break from trying to solve diversity issues, and the companies use that break to empower ERG members with really what they need to be successful in the workplace. This could involve like relationship building, developing new skills, and even learning how to navigate bias. The expectation of people of color needing to pay for equity in the workplace, it has to stop. And I use the word pay intentionally when we think about free labor and the cost to the careers in terms of folks who are doing this work. Last month, I posted an article called Want to Do Right by Your Black Employees, Start by Renegotiating the Terms of Your ERGs, that speaks more to this. So folks can access that piece from my LinkedIn profile if they have an interest in learning more.
If you want to drop that in the chat, that would be great as we move on to other speakers. And speaking of the chat, if you have questions, we're going to leave a few minutes at the end for questions. So if you're a participant who has a question for one of the panelists, please use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of the screen. So Maurice, we're going to move on to you now. What does it feel like to be Black in tech right now?
That's an interesting question. One, I would say,
how has it changed over the last 6 months, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, so I would want to sort of like caveat the question, I mean, the answer with, I mean, my experience is not all Black people's experience. So I just want to frame that. I think for me, being a Black person, particularly a Black man who is responsible for leading inclusion and diversity at a tech company, one that is largely white, there's a double responsibility of one, like providing education, supporting our teams, making sure that folks feel cared for and accounted for in that regard. But the other end is every day I show up as a Black person, as a Black man in a space. And so part of that is sort of like trying to navigate, renegotiate, and sort of like think about the ways in which I ensure that I'm not sort of bringing in the heavy load that one often carries in spaces, and not sort of like perpetuating that out. So it's hard to sort of like navigate and think about what that really means in a space that isn't really designed for you. And so for me, it's about thinking about how do I support the folks that are in the space, who are feeling these things, who are experiencing the trauma, who have to then carry the same weight that I'm also carrying it. And how do I create meaningful opportunities for those folks to feel like they're cared for and feel like that their voices are heard. And the fact of the matter is we don't always get it right. And it's an ongoing sort of process and journey, but it's hard. It's hard, especially when you think about the fact that in many spaces, even in the ones in which I operate at work, folks are like, for a week, everyone wanted to be an anti-racist and everyone wanted to talk about the things and everyone wanted to do the work, but those conversations are not existing in the same way that they existed 3 months ago. The way in which we're approaching that, the commitments have waned, like you talked about earlier. And so when you think about that, and you think about the fact that folks who don't have the decision to then reorient themselves, it sort of makes this process sort of one worse, because now you've exacerbated this beast that already existed, in so much that clearly now people can magically see that racism exists, and now we put the blinders back on. So what do you expect folks who experience those things to do with that every single day? And I haven't said that, I can't say that I've completely solved for that, but I think part of it is sort of like taking it day by day, making honest and be true to the folks that are experiencing that and giving them space to sort of name that, and then sort of figuring out what are the ways in which I can elevate the voice and elevate my privilege in the space to say, no, we're still committing to this, we're recommitting to this, and we're going to be even more explicit about the work that we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about kind of the waning level of support, interest. How are you managing that? Do you feel like you have the support of your company? Are you talking to colleagues at other companies who feel like, they are really seeing a difference in how the executive leadership at the company is approaching these issues, either through resources that you're getting or some other kinds of support? Have you seen that kind of change?
Yeah, I mean, so I've only been at Fastly for a year, and I would say based on the work that I've been doing for the last year, yes, I see that support. I do think there needs to be more, but I think part of that is white folks who sort of are in the helm of leadership in most of these spaces don't really have to wrestle with this on a daily basis. And when that happens, and now you're sort of like coming to terms with that, it's like, yes, I want to do more, but oftentimes you don't really know why, because it's not at the forefront of your consciousness. It's not at the center of the work that you do, and you didn't design your company to be built for the people that need your support right now. And so I think part of the process for us is sort of naming that, being honest with my executive team, at least the ones that I have the access to, and saying, hey, in order for this to happen, we need to do X. We need to commit to these things. We need this amount of money to be there. And luckily enough, I do have that support. I am able to sort of like move on those things. Can we do more? Can we broaden our imagination around it? Absolutely. But if I'm looking at this compared to some of my other colleagues who are still struggling to sort of get the budget, still struggling to sort of like make improvements as it relates to like workplace experience for folks, I would say that I feel like I'm in a good place, and I'm able to sort of move some of those things forward, though it may not be completely enough.
So, I mean, what are some of those things that you're asking for? Like, what would it look like for a company to be really committed to being anti-racist?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really examining like current practices, particularly around hiring and promotions, thinking about the way in which we pay people, re-examining the way in which we sort of level folks in the company. If I'm just thinking about really systematic things that exist in companies, like the way in which we define the bar, like really understanding that the way in which we sort of assess talent is based on a pattern, and we sort of pattern match to XYZ thing that usually fits folks who went to 4 schools, who worked at 4 companies, and who often don't look like me. And so sort of reorienting ourselves around that, recognizing that the bar that we created, this idea of meritocracy is BS, and that the way in which we have to really think about this is really understanding like how do we apply equity lens into the work. And so part of that equity for some people may seem biased, may seem unfair. It may seem like we are sort of like over-indexing on other folks, but the fact of the matter is, because folks who sort of exist on the fringes and the margins are never really designed for, and I'm going to keep talking about that, you're not going to see any movement. So if you're not actually designing for those folks, then you might as well just throw it out the window, because it's just lip service. And so I think what companies can do is sort of really begin centering those experiences, centering those employees, listening to those folks, uplifting them, paying them more, and giving them a voice that actually like do the work. Because the fact of the matter is not that folks don't have opinions or thoughts about what can be done and can be changed. Most folks are not in a place or not in a place to sort of be listened to or to be able to like move the work forward. So I think centering those perspectives is one of the first things that you can do. Yeah,
one thing I read, actually, I'm going to ask Marion or Herman to drop the link to the Washington Post article that talks about the extra labor that ERGs are doing. Mm-hmm. There are some examples in there that I thought were really, prescient, and to that point, like, how do you make sure that those voices are heard, but that you're actually, if somebody runs the Blackbird's ERG at Twitter, mm-hmm. I'm using that as an example, not anything that actually happened at Twitter, but like that person's particular manager doesn't value the work, is that person going to get, you know, dinged on their performance evaluation because, you know, their manager, who may be in like whatever HR, finance, or whatever department, doesn't see that that is a valuable thing for them to be spending their time on. It's not an official part of their job description. And so there was one thing, I think, I forget what company I read about in this article, but said that what they started doing was including group leadership as an element of the performance review, which then, and paying, which is obviously tied to compensation, so that these things start to show up in the way that we're compensating people who are doing the extra work. So
and I think the other part of that is, like leaders of the company, C-suite folks, particularly CEO, their job is to sort of like echo this throughout the company, because the fact of the matter is most folks are not going to take it seriously unless your CEO says it. And so if your CEO isn't modeling that sort of behavior, if they're not saying that this is explicitly a part of everyone's job and I expect this, and if I'm not tying this to performance, I'm not tying this to your bonus, like none of these things are actually going to move forward. Like people respond to when their money's affected and their quote unquote livelihood, even though that's BS. But I think when you sort of reorient this around, like, hey, if you don't do these things, your bonus is affected. If you don't do these things, you know, you won't qualify for these promotions. You'll see a huge shift. People will then all be saying they want to be anti-racist because they want their money. Because that's at the core of the way in which we live in a capitalist society. So, you know, if you tie it to the things that people want to hear and feel like are important, then people can figure it out.
So Ulysses, moving on to you, I have a similar question. How does it feel to be Black in tech these days?
And I have a similar answer to Maurice. I had a good cathartic cry the other day, so hopefully I'll make it through these reflections without kind of breaking down. But honestly, it's been hard. It's been really, really hard. And I've even been less than forthcoming with my own like close friend group around just all the struggles in the workplace, and not necessarily because of my workplace. I think I'm grateful to be where I am. I'm happy where I am. I love the work that I do and I'm fulfilled by it. It's just being pulled in 20 million directions with kind of this newfound popularity, right? Both internally and externally. Right, that's made it really difficult to even, it took me, I was saying to Marion earlier that it took me forever to respond to Becca because my inbox is so obnoxious, and it just takes me so long to get back. And I think, you know, I'm grateful to have the support system that I have. Some of whom are on this call. I saw Alex Brown from LinkedIn, you know, and my closest friends for years, you know, Ty McRae at Pinterest and Cornell Woodson at Google. You know, really, and James at Bluevine, who've really been helpful in grounding me. But it's hard to show up every day for other people when you're still trying to process a lot of things yourself and still help lead a lot of these efforts. It was, the last few months have been a little frustrating at times. Honestly, I'm actually off for the month of September. I took a step back for the month of September because I found myself less than patient, becoming much less than patient with people who I know are well-intentioned and are really looking to learn, but I'm just like, God, I just want you to read a book. You don't need me to help you unpack this. I found myself, I think the worst part was I found myself getting a little numb to what was happening in the world around me, and was getting to a very dangerous point where I was accepting it as normal. And I think that is the part that gave me pause. Because it just was, it's frustrating to deal with at times. And so, you know, I think people are trying to show up. I think people are really trying to do the right things, but it is hard personally to keep doing this work. And you see people like, we've been saying these same things for years. Like, thanks for tuning in. But yeah, that's my short answer to that part of your question.
Yeah, I mean, that rings very true for me. And it is hard not to be cynical, you know, when you've been fighting these fights for so long and it happens yet again, and then people kind of well up and you think this might be the moment when things change, and then it kind of like drops back down again. So I hear that, and I'm glad that you're taking the month off, and thank you for joining us at the beginning of your of your vacation. I mean, you know, if companies, the same kind of similar question to what I asked Maurice, if companies were doing this well, like what does real structural change look like and not just in a company, because I know, you know, it's not like a 200 employee company is going to change the world, but across the industry, like what kinds of things would we need to see in order for there to be real lasting structural change to make the tech industry maybe the first anti-racist industry in the history of American capitalism?
You know, I'm gonna put a pin in that one. Last part, and I'm here for the optimism. I think I appreciate the things that have been said, particularly around the workplace in particular. I'm going to go a different direction because I think this is what tech has missed. And the folks who know me well know that a lot of the things that we talk about typically on panels, I'm like, Lynn's been doing that, we've been doing that, mostly because my own philosophy on kind of the way that this practice and this function is supposed to run is a little divergent from what tech has typically seen it as. And while this work might seem new to tech, it's not new to any other industry that you unfortunately has been incredibly insular, and frankly has embarked on a lot of practices that are sometimes nonsensical and other times incredibly flawed. And so I'm fortunate to have worked in government and consulting and higher education, right, and doing a lot of this work before coming into tech and just saying like, my resolve here is to build a function that doesn't look like anywhere else in tech, period. Right, and so we've undertaken things. So yes, we pay our ERGs. Yes, we do all that work because that's baseline what we should be doing. But what's harder for tech companies is where I want people to go, is to start thinking about what this means for the products and services that they put out into the market, right? And what it means for the industries in which you sit, right? Because 99.9% of tech companies who are founded all started and want to label themselves as disruptors. But nobody wants to disrupt the terrible things, the social ills. We want to disrupt, very small slivers of technology. But if the 2010 Citizens United decision taught us anything around free speech and corporations and being able to take very specific stances on things and demonstrate that through your actions, this will be the time to actually do those things. And so when we talk about really addressing structural and institutional racism, what we've been doing at Blend and what I've been encouraging other companies and helping colleagues to start thinking through is, the example I'll illustrate here is, we sit at the intersection of technology and financial services. Particularly the mortgage industry. We know, if you want to read the book, and I sent it as a follow-up, The Color of Money, right, really grounds a lot of the work that we do at Blend. But we've known for years, decades, right, that entire, our financial services system in the United States, ranging from access, right, there are more liquor stores in Black and brown neighborhoods than there are banks, right? We know there's an issue of trust, particularly post-2008, right, with banks and credit unions. But we've got to start building, but we have potential to actually build things that will actually change and mitigate discrimination in those processes. But we've got to start to address root causes rather than just symptoms. We could spend all of our time building something that banks and credit unions probably won't even use because, one, it's not legal on the regulatory front because regulations haven't changed in favor of being able to use different data sources in underwriting, right? And then also because while we may be a fairly small company, we don't have all the agency, and we're fairly well known, we don't have all the agency to make those changes. And so we've released, kind of soft launched our Equitable ecosystem initiative, which really does focus on this very particularly. So everything from how do we talk about financial education while we're dismantling other systems, but how do we actually help educate Black and brown folks around how to navigate some of these terrible systems. The reality is Black and Latinx individuals have been paying $765 million annually in extra interest, right? In extra interest on mortgage loans, right? That's bananas to think about. And it should be something that is incredibly alarming to many of us, right? And the reasons why that's happening. So when we talk about what tech can do, it's really addressing things on that end, both on the regulatory front where we all have agency. Most of these companies out here lobby anyway, and they could be doing those things, right? And it's also what we end up building, right? And how we do that in partnership with the community.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important that you brought that up. And, I think that for us at TechEquity, that is very true. Like that is our focus, is public policy, and how can we get tech companies and tech workers to really be engaged on the public policy change that we need in order to fix these root structural equity issues. You know, in fintech in particular, we know there is bias. We came in and did a talk on, you know, racism in the American housing system for Blend employees. I think it's really critical that any tech company that's working on just about anything, you know, needs to have that grounding and understanding about how these issues play out, and then understand how they can use their power to fix those issues and to make sure that they don't, you know, to Cynthia's point, that they're not embedding racism into their products and business models along the way. So I'm going to move on to Natrina now, who runs the Next Chapter program, which I'm going to let you introduce, but is also is kind of an example of a way that tech companies have stepped up to try to make real commitments to equity in the industry. And so Natrina Gandana, I'm going to let you introduce Next Chapter and tell us, give your kind of point of view on how that is one way that tech is addressing racism in the industry.
Absolutely. So thank you, Catherine, and thank you so much for having me here. It's so amazing to also be on the same panel as all of these really incredible people. So thank you. At Next Chapter, we believe that talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. You know, I've spent the last 8 years of my career working inside prison education, teaching coding inside incarcerated spaces. And the question that I heard time and time and time again from our students was, what does my future really look like? You know, will people actually hire me? They're spending 8 hours a day, 5 days a week dedicated to learning how to code. But we also know how difficult the job market is for people returning from incarceration. And at the time, we had tech executives and leaders come into our classroom, talk about how tech is an equalizer, talk about how tech levels the playing field. But we know that that's not true. And we know it's not true for Black and brown folks, and we know it's not true for formerly incarcerated people as well. So Kenyatta Liao, who is my reentry director, and we decided to design a true pathway from incarceration to tech through apprenticeships and wraparound services, now called Next Chapter. Our goal is to transform the tech sector by creating a more equitable workplace for people leaving incarceration. We do this through an 8-month paid apprenticeship program, and we simultaneously work closely with companies to identify the barriers in HR, legal, engineering, and provide individual wraparound services to our students. What we're really trying to get at is the difference between equality and equity. It's one thing to actually get your foot in the door and get a job, but it's a whole other thing to address the barriers, both systemic and cultural, that actually deny people real opportunities. And so we want to provide support for people not to just survive in the industry, but thrive. Our first cohort of apprentices are now all full-time engineers at Slack. And right now I'm proud to say that we have companies like Slack, Zoom, and Dropbox as part of our 2020 cohort. So very exciting.
What are you seeing from the company side in terms of their commitment to this program?
Yeah.
Are they really stepping up, or is it more like, yeah, this is fine on the side, but it's not?
Yeah. I mean, I always think about, it's not enough just to throw money at the issue. It's easy to donate millions of dollars, like you mentioned earlier, and kind of congratulate yourself and say, we've solved racism, great job, But it's a whole nother thing to actually invest in people and invest time, resources, and energy, money into actually changing the culture of your company. And so, like I mentioned, when I was working at my former company doing coding education inside prison, we had all these tech companies come in, and they all were like so impressed by what we were doing, so impressed by our students, and said to me, this is the most coders of color I've ever seen. And they are supporting our program, they're donating to our program. But when our student would actually get released, there was still a resistance to hiring. It felt ironic, right? Like all this education was going nowhere because opportunity was not available. And so it taught me that companies really need to invest in structural change and think about how to build pathways for people to create intergenerational wealth for themselves, breaking cycles of poverty, breaking cycles of incarceration. The nonprofits that they're donating to are going to need more money next year and the next year and the year after that. It'll feel good, but it's not really enough. And so not only are we asking our companies to invest time, resources, energy, education, I work closely with legal, PR, HR, all these different entities. And I also work very closely in trying to shift the culture inside the company, similar to what TechEquity is trying to do. We do speaker series, lunch and learns, education programs, really to provide an idea of what systemic racism is inside prisons, as well as the challenges of reentry to change hearts and minds and embrace the program. I agree with everyone. We don't want tech companies to make anti-racism, justice reform, or BLM a passing trend. At the end of the day, what I really want is for companies to look at their own house. Identify the ways that you're blocking certain people, you're denying access to a real seat at the table. So investing in innovative approaches and hiring is one small step in the right direction.
So I would say, and this is going to be a question for all of the panelists, and then we're going to go to sort of audience Q&A. So if you have questions, please drop them into the Q&A chat now, and we'll get to them in just a minute. I also want to say, just speaking to the sort of structure, how do we address the structural equity issues in the world at large? Very much the work that TechEquity is focused on. We're doing an event next week. If you are registered to vote in California, you know very well that there are always a lot of ballot initiatives on the California ballot. This year is no different. There are a slew of extremely important ballot initiatives, including several that touch on racial equity. And we are doing an event next week that runs through the ballot initiatives that touch on racial equity issues to let you know how we think you should vote on them, and to kind of enlighten you a little bit about what the issues are and how you should be thinking about your choice when you vote. So hopefully you will join us for that. It's next Thursday at noon, same time. You'll get an email about it, but I just want to plug that. If you are wanting to do something more that is structural, that is addressing the sort of deeper issues that Ulysses was talking about, please join us for that event. And so the last question, I want to go around in the order that we started. So starting with you, Cynthia. At TechEquity, we have a lot of non-Black tech workers who are really great allies. And I think that many of them struggle to understand what they should be doing. I think when we have conversations about diversity and inclusion, it's very easy to say like, oh, we just hired the D&I person, or, there's an ERG for that. And for everybody else in the company to just sit by passively and say like, oh, we did our part because we hired that role or whatever. But obviously it's going to take everybody to get us out of this. And so I'm wondering if you can, if you're giving advice to white or non-Black allies who work in tech, what can they do tomorrow to help advance this conversation?
Sure, that's a really good question. My real focus or interest is getting people to actually listen to what the needs of people are. If you want to know how to help, I say just listen to what folks are asking. You can find that information from through employee resource groups. You can find that information from engagement surveys in terms of feedback that people give. But then the other thing that I'm really hoping that folks will do is, to Maurice's point, really push to tie incentives to how people exhibit diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And then also, I think about capacity and competencies that leaders have. I think that it's really critical that anybody who is responsible for managing people of color or people in general, that they show those core competencies when it comes to being very inclusive. And I would love for our allies to really push the need for inclusive leaders.
Do you think allies, and I know many don't know if they should be doing this, but should they join ERG groups? Should they show up at the meetings? And if so, how should they show up?
I have always been involved in where allies show up to the groups, and I think that allies should show up and listen and be there to really support and serve. I don't know that, I think that making progress without the support and input from allies, I think that that can be challenging. I think that you run into real problems though when allies, want to lead and speak on behalf of others. So I think that it is a delicate balance.
Maurice, over to you. What can allies do, rank and file tech worker allies do to help advance this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a few things. I think one, like listen to similar to what Cynthia said, listen to the people who you're talking about. Two, actually read and read beyond like the three books that everyone wants to pass around. They're Black women in particular and Indigenous women who've been talking about this stuff for a while. Like understand like how like the impacts of capitalism, the impacts of like sexism, misogyny, all those things, how they affect folks of color across the board, but particularly listen to the radical politics that comes out of folks like Angela Davis and a bunch of other folks that are doing and have been talking about the things that we're living in and dealing with now. Then I think the third piece of it is if you're an ally, you have power, you have positionality, use that power and positionality to elevate voices that often are not in the room. So if you are on an interesting project and there is room for someone else, like ask or like recommend that there's someone else in your team who wouldn't have gotten access otherwise to be a part of that. So I think sort of modeling behaviors that one, give access points, and two, sort of elevate voices that are often ignored, I think is a really good a place to start.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's important. And one of my pet peeves is that, when there's an opportunity to lift somebody up, we usually, you get the opportunity to speak on the panel or whatever when it's about like Black issues. How about give those folks an opportunity to speak about another thing that they are expert in, that's related to their job or whatever, and not just only tap people when it's about, Black or race issues. Ulysses, same question to you.
Not too dissimilar. I'm going to keep encouraging people to really take the time to hone in on the reading piece. I think that is just fundamental, right? Understanding the history, particularly the very complex and complicated history that the United States has with race, right? We can talk about many other things. It's easy to talk about gender, it's easy to talk about sexual orientation and go to all the pride parties, but the minute we talk about race, we shut down. And we have to acknowledge that very complex history and learn just how deep it is and how deeply ingrained it is into some of the institutions that many of us hold to be the most sacred, right? So I think being able to understand that complexity first, before just trying to jump on to the top 10 things I can do to be the best ally ever, right? Would be my guidance there. And also understand you have access to rooms that I will probably never have access to, and that's just an unfortunate reality, right? And so when you're in those rooms, when you're speaking with congressional leaders, when you're speaking with your legislators or people who are actually willing to listen to you because they actually think you know something other than just the diversity stuff, right? Then use that agency that you have in that moment, right, to actually highlight these issues and drive people toward actual solutions that are addressing those root causes that Cynthia really elaborated on earlier.
Natrina.
Yeah, so obviously, like, I am not a Black and brown person and I am not formally incarcerated. And I think that first of all is like kind of like what you need to do as an ally, recognize that your experience is going to be completely different than people who've actually had that lived experience. So completely agree with what you were saying about creating space, about there's a difference between, being a voice for the voiceless and just passing the mic. Like, let someone else talk about it and recognize that you might not have the answers. But completely agree. Education is really important. I think that reading The New Jim Crow 10 years ago for me was the reason why I'm here today, and like investing in the time and energy, and also thinking about ways that you have power. It's not just you as a tech worker, but potentially maybe you own property. Maybe you are a hiring manager. Maybe you have other areas where you can actually influence change that you don't even know that you could be potentially being biased towards this for a specific group of people.
That's great. I'm gonna invite Marion back to the conversation, who's been monitoring the Q&A, and looks like there's a lot of questions. So let's try to get through as many of them as we can.
Yeah, there are sure a lot of questions, and thank you all so much for this conversation. This has been a pleasure to participate in. I'm going to try to get to as many questions as possible, but we'll see what we can do in the next 10 minutes. So first up, we have some questions about company accountability. How can we keep our companies accountable on salary, promotion, and other compensation negotiation processes when they aren't often visible to all employees? And then more broadly, what kind of metrics and measures can we use can companies, both like at the management level and at the rank and file level, use to see if things are becoming less systematically racist within the company itself?
Yeah, if you can't measure it, you can't change it, right? So how are we making that stuff transparent?
And this is for anyone.
I mean, I think that there are different tools that companies can subscribe to really help in terms of tracking those data points. And even when it comes to salary negotiation, I can find one and actually put it in the chat for you. In fact, I think it's Compass that's on my mind. But I think that the issue of transparency is something different. And that really kind of goes back to leadership and the decisions that senior leaders make when it comes to making these data points transparent. You know, one of the things that I always say is that there are two people who really understand the D&I plan, and that's the D&I director and the comms department. They need to take that power from the comms department and really invest in making information transparent. But I don't think that, I haven't seen much evidence of that as of yet. I'd love to hear from people who are actually on the inside.
Yeah, and I'll just say, just from TechEquity's perspective, we publish a salary schedule, and we attach salary ranges to all of our job descriptions, which is one step. I mean, we're very small, so it's hard for us to do an analysis over, you know, if you're a company of hundreds of employees. I would ask, I mean, this is one thing you can ask your company to do, is have a transparent salary schedule. And then do an analysis every year. It doesn't have, you can anonymize this easily to say, how are the Black and brown and other underrepresented groups stacking up against the white employees or overrepresented groups in that? And let's adjust that when we see that there are mistakes. When they're doing that in the open, I think it's easier to hold them accountable. And so I think that one thing you could start is a campaign to get your company to adopt those kinds of practices. Maurice or Ulysses, do you have anything to add on that one? All right, Marianne.
All right. This one is for Natrina. How does the Next Chapter program address the stigma with incarceration among employers? And then also, are there kinds of accommodations for formerly incarcerated students and workers implemented in the workplace to address trauma and help them actually integrate well into the company?
Absolutely. So for the first question, you know, prior to COVID, we would actually bring tech executives to San Quentin to visit our classroom and really get that proximity and understand that, you know, there's nothing scary about being in this situation, and try to really reduce their biases. So now we're really changing to a more virtual model similar to the entire world of getting that engagement, listening to people, talking to people, to our students who are formerly incarcerated, talking to our reentry director who is also formerly incarcerated, and really getting them that proximity coupled with education. So that's one. And for the second question, we link each of our apprentices with a professional development coach that is also a licensed therapist. So they meet with them on a biweekly basis to talk about issues of just being in a tech company in general, while also being coupled with the fact that they are formerly incarcerated and have their own traumas that they've dealt with.
And you said, Natrina, that you all provide wraparound services. Can you say a little bit more about what those look like?
Absolutely. So we partner with organizations around the country that do, you know, if they need to transfer parole, if they need to find housing, if they need a case management services. There's no one size fits all for all of our students because they all have their different issues. Some of them aren't on parole, some of them are. So really being able to provide those services on one side is great, but another side is really being able to link them up with the education that they need. So some of our students, all of our students actually go through Hack Reactor. We provide a scholarship to Hack Reactor, which is the boot camp, so that they can continue their education while also kind of their first touch base with, especially after leaving incarceration, of being in a social tech environment. When they're inside prison learning how to code, they're doing this all without internet access. So it's definitely a huge change to actually be outside learning how to code. So we provide that. We provide a financial stipend so that the entire time that they're working, they don't they don't get out of bed without getting paid, basically. We want to make sure that they are fully supported. We have a reentry director who is like a mentor coach, talks to them on a weekly basis, addresses any issues that they might have. I'm more on the structural end where I'm talking to the companies and their PR. And then we have an engineering director who works one-on-one with them while they're at the companies to support them so that the companies don't feel like they're alone in this, you know, oh, like I have to mentor someone, this is going to be a lot of work for me. We have an individual who works one-on-one with them on their code reviews, pair programming, pretty much anything that they might need on the engineering front.
Got it. And somebody asked in the chat the name of the program. It's Next Chapter. And
Next Chapter.
if you want to drop a link in the chat, that'd be great. Marianne, a couple more questions.
Yeah. So we had some interesting conversation. Maurice, you brought up incentivizing employees with their salary to be engaging in these programs. And then also, I think, Catherine, you mentioned, can tech be the first anti-racist industry in the history of American capitalism? And so I wanted to tie a couple questions together. Can we touch more on tying incentives to broadly anti-racist behavior? And how can we make sure that this isn't just performative in order to get that paycheck? And then also what panelists think about any industry in tech being truly anti-racist within the current system of American capitalism.
Big questions. Maurice.
I mean, I think that racism and capitalism are like one and the same in many regards. So I don't think any industry or any company will ever be truly anti-racist so long as capitalism stands. And so operating sort of in this system in which we exist, I would argue that, yes, performative anti-racism is not great. However, if in the system where where like the reality is just racism, I'd much rather have at least the measurements or the mechanisms in place to create more equitable systems, even if someone's just sort of checking like the box around like, hey, I know that I need to do these things. I know that I need to include these folks. I know that this system needs to be in place. I'd rather have those things in place than to just have just straight racism where folks just don't even get to participate in the system at all. Now, do I think that that is enough? Absolutely not. But I do think it's important to name that the system that we operate in is fundamentally flawed. And the incentive is to sort of like just create to create and operationalize things that should already be in place now. So that's just my 2 cents.
And I just want to say I agree with Maurice in terms of as long as we operate in a capitalist society, it's going to be really challenging in terms of the anti-racist piece. But I did put a link to the Kapor Capital's impact report. Kapor Capital only invests in opportunity gap closing companies, so opportunity gap closing for people of color or for people from lower income backgrounds. And they've done very well with their current investment thesis. So I put the link to the report in the chat.
Great. All right, Marianne, we have time for one more.
All right, perfect. As we've been talking we've been talking a lot about anti-racism within the tech industry, and we've also been talking about, as Maurice and Cynthia mentioned just now, of like how racism expands far beyond the industry. And so how do we, and at what point do we start to put an emphasis on massive, broad policy change that we need in order to truly dismantle racism and anti-Black racism especially? So combating the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, mass incarceration, as Natrina touched on. How do we make that shift both within our tech companies and then just with the tech industry at large?
Yeah, we love that question at TechEquity, and I guess I would amend it to say, how can tech companies be engaged in these conversations? How can tech workers plug in and be engaged in these conversations beyond the 4 walls of their companies? How do we move that conversation? Ulysses, maybe I'll go to, or Cynthia, were you getting ready to chime in there?
Well, I'm reluctant to chime in because I'm just in the very early stages, and maybe feedback on this idea could help move this along. In the process of thinking about how we can develop a course that is kind of like a 101 when it comes to systemic racism, what is it that diversity and inclusion practitioners need to know when it comes to systemic racism in order to be effective in doing their jobs?
Ulysses?
Yeah, similarly, I think, you know, when the murder of George Floyd happened, we actually had a company-wide dialogue on race, right? And I know a lot of people have been poo-pooing those things, but it was important as a first learning step because a lot of people, this is the first time people are having some of these conversations, and to be able to have it with colleagues is very different. We didn't stop there though. We had a follow-on conversation around distinguishing discrimination in consumer banking, very specifically, to identify what that looks like. I don't think any one tech company is going to automatically dismantle racism in all of the various systems and structures that in which it's currently present. But being able to recognize what industry you are in, right, what your product is actually servicing, and again, looking to address those root causes in that particular area, that's how we were able to really come up with specific things to identify and say, yes, we could build an alternative data model so that we are providing alternatives to the credit score that's typically used so that we can help gig workers and other folks who might not be paid a salary by check, but by cash, or be using something else in order to demonstrate credit history. But there's also the regulatory aspect of that, where we actually have to partner with organizations like TechEquity and National Association of Real Estate Brokers and National Bankers Association, right, to make sure we are having these conversations and not telling people what's best for them without ever asking, right, and being meaningfully engaged to make those changes, right?
Yeah.
So it's a lot deeper than this, but there are definitely avenues and venues for companies of all sizes to make sure that they're getting involved in that work to address things structurally.
Yeah, I think that's really important to look at, not just the kind of HR department or whatever at your particular company, but also the impact of the product and the business model that the company is building and its role in perpetuating racism. So on that note, again, I'm going to plug the event that we're having next week. If you're a voter in California, this is a really critical opportunity for you to learn more about how you can use your vote to advance racial equity in California. There are really some big issues on the ballot that will do a lot to address those structural issues. If you work in tech, we would love for you to join TechEquity as a member. It's $10 a month. We bring your voice to the table in all of the advocacy work that we do. So if you care about fixing structural change and addressing these issues in public policy, we ask you to join us. And some people have been asking if this will be recorded. It is being recorded, and we will be making it available. Everybody who attended will be getting a follow-up email, not just with the recording, but with a list of other resources that our speakers have mentioned and that what we think are really important as well, including a link to register for next week's event. So I want to thank all of our panelists for really taking the time to have this really important conversation. I want to acknowledge that you are doing it for free, some of you on vacation, and that you have shared with us, and that's really important, and we value your time. And thank you for doing the work that you're doing. We hope to see you all soon. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.